Another way to illustrate the point of that first video. I didn't actually mean to make that a second video, or this a second video, but I am a rookie at this, so hopefully it'll get better as we go. Anyway, what we're trying to illustrate is, again, the concept of compliance and elasticity and what or how that is different between arteries and veins. So compliance, or how stretchable a vessel is, equals a change in the volume that's put in the vessel divided by the amount of wall pressure. And if the wall pressure increases, then compliance will go down. There is an inverse or indirect relationship between wall pressure and compliance. So the artery has less compliance, but more elastic recoil. So during systole, illustrated over here, when the aortic valves open and a volume of blood shoots into the aorta, that volume stretches the wall of the artery, but because that pressure is high, there is elastic recoil, which will then bring the pressure down and that will then return the vessel to its original state and push the volume of blood forward. Whereas in the veins, there is very little wall pressure. So if a volume of blood is in the vein, there's no elasticity. It's there unless external skeletal muscle increases contraction in order to milk the vein and bring fluid forward. So external skeletal muscle would increase the amount of volume that's pushed forward towards the heart, and that is dependent on movement, which makes complete sense because the more that we move, the more blood we'll need in order to support and oxygenate our muscles. So a good example is the gastric nemus vein, or the great saphenous vein in your leg. So you are standing, obviously your skeletal muscle, your gastric nemus muscle isn't contracting. But if I walk or run, then the gastric nemus muscle contracts and milks the vein in order to push more blood forward into the heart to support an increase in cardiac output, to support the increase in my activity. And that's why veins are a reserve for cardiac output. So, other determinants of blood flow. So to review, we know that compliance and elasticity have a lot to do with the determination of blood flow. Compliance, try to think of this now in terms of compliance and elasticity. Does compliance, if there's an increase in compliance, what does that do to flow? If there's an increase in elasticity, what does that do to flow? I'm going to pause for a second, try to see if you can answer that question. So if there's an increase in compliance, like a vein, that means flow decreases because there's no elastic recoil. We just stretch out the vessel, and that means that unless there's an external factor such as skeletal muscle, flow will not move forward. Elasticity, an increase in elasticity would increase flow because that recoil pushes fluid forward. Directionality is a new concept, and what that's talking about is how the blood flow is layered. The way it's supposed to go, if this is a blood vessel, is that white blood cells and platelets and those types of things are supposed to go in the center, and then red blood cells along the outside, and they're supposed to go evenly down without any turbulence, and that helps flow to be smooth. If there is anything that disturbs the flow or causes the clotting factors to come in contact with the vessel wall, or causes blood to move crosswise, such as So if platelets or clotting factors came in contact with the vessel wall, that might cause a clot. If blood bumped off and moved across, then we might have turbulence, which could also trigger clot formation and decrease flow. So there's a nicer picture of that on your slides under laminar versus turbulent flow. Think to yourself, if you can, about one health problem that could potentially lead to an increase in turbulent flow. So one of those things, which I'll talk about further, is if there's the development of atherosclerosis. So if there's any plaque that develops on the vessel wall, then there won't be laminar flow. You're going to cause turbulent or crosswise flow. The other issue, big issue for determining flow, is pressure gradient as well as resistance. So if there's a pressure gradient, meaning there's one section of the vessel with high pressure and the next section of the vessel with low pressure, then that'll increase flow. So flow and pressure have a direct relationship. If the pressure gradient goes up, then flow goes up. So if you first deposit, the stroke volume enters the aorta, creating an increased pressure from the walls of the arteries plus the volume of blood, then the elastic recoil pushes that forward. There was also a big pressure gradient that was created. Think about what would happen if we're relying on pressure gradients to the flow of blood if somebody lost volume, such as through hemorrhage or through dehydration. If there's less of a pressure gradient, then there'll be a decreased flow because they have a direct relationship. On the other hand, resistance has an indirect relationship with flow, meaning if resistance increases, then flow decreases. The largest influence on resistance is radius. So if the radius, this should be decrease. If the radius decreases, then the resistance goes up. So a blood vessel, someone who has hypertension or atherosclerosis, the vessel becomes, the opening inside, the radius itself becomes smaller. That means there's an increased resistance, and that'll decrease the amount of flow because there's an indirect relationship. This becomes very important as it illustrates the relationship between hypertension and end organ damage. If I have hypertension and that's decreased the radius of the blood vessel and increased resistance, which means there's a decreased flow, then there's going to be less oxygen-rich blood that gets to organs, which could eventually cause hypoxic damage.